Hi, I'm Kathy Corey, and I'm very happy to be presenting Pilates, a history, visions, purpose, and power. I call this a history because in my 42 years of teaching Pilates, we have learned so much information that my lecture on the history continues to evolve and change. There's so much misinformation today about Mr. Pilates that you'll find even on the internet, that over the years has been more of a folklore than actual facts. So this helps to authenticate the truth and create the realization of the history rather than the myths of Pilates. We begin with Mr. Pilates having had a bust of himself created that he had in his studio in New York. But I do believe in legacy. I do believe in heritage. And I think we need to start at the beginning. So Joseph Hubertus Pilates was born December 9th, 1883 in Mönchengladbach, Germany. We have a copy of his original birth certificate. And what is most interesting, I think, about this is that many articles and newspapers, even on the internet, you will see that he was not born in 1883, but it says he was born in 1880, making him actually 3 years older than he really was. And in fact, he often bragged about, oh, look at me, I am 80 years old and I am so strong and so fit for being this old, when in fact he was really 77 years old. And so the other fact about this is that his wife, Clara Pilates, was also born in 1883, making her 3 years older than him. So maybe at the time, he did not want to appear that he was with a woman who was much older than him. So he was born the second eldest of 9 children. His parents were Helena and Frederick, and he was a very thin, frail child, and he was often picked on by older boys. And in one of the fights where the boys were chasing and fighting him, he actually lost the sight in his left eye. The story is that someone threw a rock at his eye and he lost the sight. But even as a child, he was very enthusiastic about gymnastics. And his father owned a boxing gymnasium. So Mr. Pilates actually learned boxing from his father. And he was also given an anatomy book by a physician, a doctor friend of the family. And he used that book to train and to work his muscles, so much so that by the age of 14, he was actually able to pose for anatomy charts. And we can see here he's not 14 years old, but you can see the development of his physique was quite extraordinary and very well defined, especially at this time in the world. So from 1912 to 1919, these are the years before he came to the United States, he held many, many odd jobs. So from 1912, he went to England, and while he was there, he performed as a circus performer. He also trained Scotland Yard in self-defense. He continued to be trained as a boxer, but he was in England when the First World War began. And so at that time in 1914, he was actually interned in a camp, first in Lancaster, and then at the Isle of Man. We see here the Isle of Man, where he spent from 1914 till 1919 in this internment camp. He arrived there by boat, and he was in the first batch of the detainees at the detention camp. At that point, there were only 660 people arriving. But by the end of his internment there were many thousands of people as well. And living the wire was because the camp was enclosed by wire, so the men were detained inside this camp. And many of the men, being taken in the prime of their lives from being productive citizens, were now left in this camp with very little to do. And so many times they just walked around the perimeters of the camp, walking along the wire. As you can see on the entrance to this camp, it was a very large internment camp at the Isle of Man, and it was an all-male camp as well. And we saw over the years that it grew very, very largely to have many people staying there. But there was work at the camp. The camp itself was surrounded by a large forest with many, many trees. And they had a mill, a way to make the trees into lumber and the lumber into furniture. I often wondered how Mr. Pilates was able to create those beautiful reformers, the ones that looked more like furniture than actual reformers, with the lovely club feet, which the pictures I think most of you have seen. But that was actually a trade he must have learned while he was working at the camp during those years, building furniture. There were also many clubs at the camp. And so we had a gymnastics club, of which, maybe this was one of the ways he was keeping fit and also developing his contrology, which today we call the Pilates technique. And there was also a boxing club. So he did continue his work in the boxing field. And in looking for Mr. Pilates, especially during the earlier days, it was very difficult to find any information, particularly about his time at the Isle of Man. But we can see here, this is an entry from the list of German prisoners of war, and his surname is spelled correctly, but his first name is spelled incorrectly with an F at the end. And so many of the times people were registered with different spellings of their names. And so it was difficult to find any information about them being there. This is also a page from the internment camp newsletter. It talks about Mr. Pilates as a referee during one of the boxing matches. This is courtesy of the Manx National Heritage Society. They are located on the Isle of Man, and many of the new information that are coming will be coming from them because they're uncovering so many different articles and papers that were discarded, and they're helping us to piece together not just Mr. Pilates, but many of the camp prisoners during that First World War. We see Mr. Pilates here. He's in the center in the suit and surrounded by the medics, the medical officials at the time. And so he's also wearing the armband, meaning I believe he was able to assist the medics for ill or injured prisoners as well. It's interesting because this part of the camp is not in where he was located, and the camp was restricted so that people were not allowed to go from one section to another. But he is definitely outside of his section, meaning that he had more privileges, possibly, in helping with the sick and the injured during that time. And you can see here The blue circle was his restricted area. The red circle, which is much greater, shows where the photo was taken. So that in that compound, he was allowed more freedom to go from one place to another, possibly to not only help the sick and injured, but also maybe to acquire some of his knowledge that he later used in his rehabilitation. We saw how large the camp was, and if you go to the Isle of Man today, you can only see there's one building remaining from that incredibly large compound that was there both during the First and the Second World Wars. So life before New York. Mr. Pilates married in 1905. His first wife's name was Maria. And in 1906, on November 30th, they had a daughter, Helen, or Lenny, as she was called. Maria died in 1913, which would have been 1 year after Mr. Pilates had left to go to England. And Lenny was only known to have visited Mr. Pilates one time in New York City in 1939. So in 1919, when Mr. Pilates was released from the camp at the Isle of Man, he returned to Germany and he remarried fairly quickly after his return. His second wife was Elfried. They married in October of 1919 in Germany, and Elfried died in 1931. During that time, Mr. Pilates was running a boxing gymnasium. And at this time, he was continuing to develop his equipment and his exercises. He also trained the Hamburg military police in the art of self-defense and in physical training. And it was during this time that he met Rudolf Laban. And Laban was a very famous movement analyst. Mr. Pilates' first trip to the United States was in 1925. And during that time, he visited a patent and trademark attorney's office of Marks and Clerk in New York City on 22 Broadway. At this time, he applied for patents for the Universal Reformer. He had already applied and filed for these patents in Germany. He traveled first class and he had $800 with him. He stayed for 2 months and he listed on the manifest that his occupation was a teacher. And he listed also that his marital status was single, even though he really was married at the time. The highlights on the page show Mr. Pilates' actual listing on the manifest of alien passengers for the United States on the SS Berlin. So he returned to Germany after 2 months, but then again in April of 1926, he returned to New York. He was on a ship named the Westphalia, and on that voyage, he met Anna Clara Zuner, who we now know as Clara Pilates. They both traveled second class, and Joe arrived with $500 this time. And once again, he declared his occupation as a teacher. Clara, however, only had $35 with her, and her occupation was declared as household. Now, I know many of the articles that you read have said that she taught school, she was a teacher in the school system, or that she was a nurse. She was neither of these things. But I think some of the confusion came from the fact that when she worked at the studio, she always wore a nurse's uniform. As we know, Mr. Pilates was in very small clothing at the time. So maybe she thought the nurse's uniform gave her some authority and added some respectability to the studio as well. But her occupation was listed as household. And what that means at that time was that she could be a nanny to children in a house, or she could be a housekeeper, a house cleaner. But she would be able to work in a house. Clara declared her marital status as single. And this time, only a few months after he had come back from his first trip, he declared himself as married on the manifest, which he still was at that time. Again, we see the list for alien passengers for the United States from Hamburg in April of 1926. There's both Joe as a teacher and Clara as household. A little bit about Anna Clara Zuner. She was born February 6, 1883 in Germany. No marriages ever recorded and no children. And she ran the studio for 10 years after Joe died. She was known as the most brilliant of teachers. The master teachers all told me, Joe was the genius, but Clara was the teacher. She really knew and understood what he meant in the movements and in the exercises. And she had a really deep and strong understanding of how to perform them. And yet the master teachers say they never saw her doing the work. So she was never really seen on any of the equipment. And here we have the fact that even though they never married, they were always known as the Pilates. In the for holidays, for cards, for publicity, they were definitely known as a couple, and they spent so many years together. In 1929, Joe declared his intention to become a United States citizen. The declaration was granted in 1935. He had one witness, and that was Nat Fleischer, who was a publisher and a boxing promoter. And Nat Fleischer declared his association began with Joe in 1930. Again, there's some misinformation that said Joe came to the United States in order to train boxers, but it's here that he really just began his association with the boxing publisher and promoter in 1930. Joe at this time listed his address as 939 8th Avenue, which we know is the original Pilates studio in New York. Now he has listed his occupation as director of physical culture and marital status as now widower. Clara also declared her intention to become a United States citizen in 1933, which was granted in 1937. Again, in her papers, she's listed as not married, and her address, 939 8th Avenue, the studio address. And occupation at this time, assistant director of physical culture. We see here that Joseph Pilates applied for many patents, and this is one of the patents he applied for the reformer. And he continued to have many patents and applied for many of these trademarks over the years. And to me, that really indicates that he wanted his work protected, but he also wanted it to be shared and to really go and explore it with many people, not just hold it on just for his studio. And he was an inventor. Not only did he invent all the exercise equipment, but he also invented the Pilates bed. As you can see, it's kind of this V shape and doesn't look very comfortable, but he said that this was a better way to sleep and to actually have more relaxation in your rest. So it never really caught on anywhere, but he did continue to have brilliant ideas. He also applied and had registration for the draft. On here we see, once again, the address is 939 8th Avenue. And he lists himself as at the Pilates studio as a business owner. But I think what's most interesting about this is when he lists the person that you would have to contact if it's necessary to call someone, he lists Clara. But if you can look closely, there's no last name. There's just a line where the last name would be. So she was just known as Clara at that time. This also shows his correct birth date of December 9th, 1883. During his time in New York, Mr. Pilates had some notoriety and became somewhat well known in the community. There were articles in several magazines. And in 1962, Sports Illustrated magazine wrote an article on Mr. Pilates, and it says, "To keep in shape, act like an animal." What Mr. Pilates says here is that when he was at the Isle of Man, no man who exercised by his principles came down with the influenza in the great epidemic that swept around the world. And he was very proud of that of keeping mind, body, and spirit very healthy, and was practicing and leading men in exercises during that time. He says in this article that he figured out his principles by watching the animals in the woods and children at play. He also states, as a boxer and circus tumbler, that his exercises relaxed him. And I drink a quart of, and he had some famous actors, Katharine Hepburn, Sir Laurence Olivier, George Balanchine, were all going to his studio at that time. But it is interesting, even in the obituary in the New York Times, they said he died at 86, when in fact he was 83 years old at the time of his death. And now, if we look down at the bottom, surviving are his widow, Mrs. Clara Pilates. So this is the first time we now see Clara's last name as Pilates written anywhere. So I don't know if the New York Times added that, or if it was time for her now to take the name and to begin becoming Mrs. Clara Pilates. In a letter that was written to Clara from Master Teacher Ron Fletcher, it states, "Your letter made me very happy because it arrived on my 89th birthday. The corporation gave me a dinner party, so I am marching into my 90th. A woman should not get that old, but I am feeling fine. Thanks to Pilates system." Once again, this is the first time we see the transition from contrology into utilizing the name as a system. So here we are looking at the Pilates system rather than contrology. And this is where Clara has begun to use that. Clara died in May of 1977. She was 94 years old at the time, and again leaves a legacy as being a brilliant, brilliant teacher and really carrying on the work that Joe left behind. And they are still together, the Pilates, Clara Pilates and Joseph Pilates. The urns are in New York at the Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale. So we're looking at the survival of the Pilates method. When Mr. Pilates died in 1967, there was a small group of dedicated followers, but really he did not have a lot of success. And in the 1990s, a study reported that there were only 250 teachers in the early 1990s. Then, From 2000 to 2010, CNN, which is the cable news network, reported that Pilates was the fastest growing activity in the United States, growing over 450%. The American College of Sports Medicine ranked Pilates as one of the top fitness trends, meaning that it was no longer a fad, but something that was really here to stay. So before the 1990s, we still had fitness and we had Pilates, but they were two separate entities. At this time, there was a shifting focus into integrative medicine and integrative exercise. There was a new trend to mind-body awareness, and it became the fusion of fitness and Pilates. Because Pilates really does apply to every aspect of fitness, to every level of fitness, from our top athletes to our rehabilitation. And it was the collision of these two worlds that opened the doors for the future of Pilates. And we want to look now at who carried on this work from the 1990s. And we look through our elders. We have Eve Gentry, Carola Trier, Ron Fletcher, Kathy Grant, Ramona Krzyzanowska, Bruce King, Mary Bowen, and Lolita San Miguel. And this was the Institute for the Pilates Method in the 1990s. And you can see the board members consisted of Ron Fletcher, Bruce King, and Ramona Krzyzanowska, Carola Trier, Kathy Grant, and Eve Gentry. And so they were all together, and they really did have relationships with one another through the different years that they worked together, that they trained with Joe, and that they worked separately as well. Let's talk about each one of these master teachers. Eve Gentry was born in 1909 and died in 1994. And she worked with Joe for a very long period of time. She was an injured dancer who went to Joe, and he helped to help her with her muscle soreness and tiredness and fatigue. And she became one of the most brilliant teachers. She moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and brought the work with her there. She said, "Seeing is to movement what listening is to music. It's not enough to hear, you must listen. It's not enough to look, you must see." Carola Trier was a performer. She was born in 1913 and died in the year 2000. And she came also with an injury. You can see she was a contortionist and was a performer that often performed on roller skates as well. And she said, when you have people that can't walk and can't do things, and they walk out of your studio and they can do what they couldn't do, very often the tears came down because you don't know what you did, but you helped them. It really replaces show business applause. You get more back than you give. Ron Fletcher, 1921 to 2011. Ron was a Martha Graham dancer who went to Joe because of a knee injury and really enjoyed the work and stayed on to learn and become a teacher. Movement should be approached like life, with enthusiasm, joy, and gratitude. For movement is life, and life is movement, and we get out of it what we put into it. Ron took the work from New York and opened the first West Coast Pilates studio in Los Angeles in Beverly Hills. Kathy Grant, 1921 to 2010. You do not get two bodies, you only get one. So choose the body you're going to live in and live it. Kathy Grant was also an injured dancer who went to Joe for a knee injury and worked with him. And Kathy Grant really received a lot of work on the Wunda chair, and she was really known by even all the master teachers as really the queen of the Wunda chair. And when she said, you don't get two bodies, what she meant was you have a Pilates body and you need to choose to live in it. It's not enough to do the Pilates in the studio. You have to take it with you, put it in your body and live it. Romana Kryzanowska, 1923 to 2013. Romana was a classic Russian ballerina who also came to Joe for an injury. And you apply Pilates in everyday life, like how you sit, how you walk. There comes a point where you become Pilates and Pilates becomes you. Joe's goal was not to have people working out in the gym for hours every day. He wanted to train your body so that every move you made was a constructive exercise. And Romana went on to help Clara after Joe died. And both she and Clara worked at the studio. And then when Clara died, Romana stayed on and took over the studio at that time. Bruce King, 1925 to 1993. Bruce was also a dancer with the Merce Cunningham group, and then also had his own dance company. Also went to Joe for an injury. And Bruce not only worked at the studio, but he lived in the apartment behind the studio. So he was there many, many hours a day. And he said, you meet the person where they are, find out what they can do, and you develop them further. You don't just show them exercises. He was really a brilliant, brilliant teacher. And after the fire in the studio, which destroyed his apartment, Mr. Pilates gave him a reformer so that he could teach at his own home, which was wonderful because he said, I didn't enjoy teaching at the studio because they always made me teach 3 or 4 people. And I liked really to teach one-on-one. I really wanted to go more in depth with the work and the body. Mary Bowen was born in 1930. And she is also a Jungian psychoanalyst. At about 65, my two professions, the Pilates teacher and the Jungian psychoanalyst, began to merge. I hadn't intended this. It just happened and was joyously received. With my two disciplines, I could see the whole person, the conscious and the unconscious. And Mary is still teaching today, teaching wonderful courses that include both Pilates and her Jungian psychotherapy. Lolita San Miguel, 1934, and she is also still teaching today. We graduate with all kinds of degrees, and we've never been taught the first thing about how to work our bodies. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's the reality. And so what we have with Lolita is she went to first to Corolla for an injury. She was a ballet dancer, and she also had an injury. And she first was rehabilitated at Corolla's, and then worked at Corolla's. And one day she said to Kathy Grant, I would like to go, and I wish I had met Mr. Pilates. And Kathy said, let's go, I will take you. So Kathy Grant and Lolita San Miguel were the only two people to ever really have been certified to teach by Mr. Pilates. And they worked with him more towards the end of his life in the 60s. And so they had a very comprehensive training from Mr. Pilates. What are the common threads? We are looking at the fact that they were all injured, dancers or performers, but they went to Mr. Pilates because they were injured. They were rehabilitated and then stayed because they said, not only did this work help us to rehabilitate our injuries, but it also made us stronger and gave us a better understanding of how not to injure ourselves in our work. They all say it's not about the exercise. You must address the whole body. They also say you must continue to always be a student of this work. And they all develop the work from their own experiences, from their own personalities, and from their own backgrounds as well. Mr. Pilates really did feel that he had an amazing technique. And it says in his ad, the world needs noble and healthy, attractive men and women. So he was really looking at his system as Pilates Universal and really wanting it to be taught and spread to many, many places. And again, enrolling. You can enroll for a 3 or 6 month course. First, you have to take a trial lesson. After the trial lesson, which is an examination, you will be convinced that you will get results as promised. The lessons are 3 times a week by appointment for an hour each week. And so, again, what he's looking for here, I believe, and what we really want in our students as well, is a commitment, 3 months or 6 months, 3 times a week, because in order to really understand Pilates, it has to be something that you put into your life, not just into the work at the studio. And the trial sessions, I think there was $2 for the trial and then $75 for the entire program. And we're looking here at Mr. Pilates and his universal method, balance of mind and body. It is look not to the duality of mind-body, but to mind and body being fused into one being. It's the unity of body, mind, and spirit. Mr. Pilates had many visions, but I think his 3 major visions were to educate the child, to really put this in the school system, and in order to really have our children become healthy and have good habits. The other is that his method, he really felt, would be helpful in healing and rehabilitation settings. And the third vision, the popularity of Pilates around the world. So first, educate the child. Change happens through movement, and movement heals. And the whole country, the whole world should be doing my exercises. These are his visions, and these are the visions that we have the opportunity to realize today. First, educate the child. In childhood, habits are easily formed, good and bad. Why not then concentrate on the formation of only good habits, and thus avoid the necessity later on in life of attempting to correct bad habits and substituting for them good habits? Oftentimes impossible, even when the physical exertion is accompanied by equally strenuous mental efforts. This was written in 1934 in his book, Your Health. So what we are doing today in helping to realize, to create good patterns and not have to replace them later on with the bad patterns that were created. So the Pilates in School programs originated at the Pilates Method Alliance in 2002. The Pilates for Children and Adolescents book was published in 2014 as a resource. And now the Deputy Mayor of Mönchengladbach, where Mr. Pilates was born, the City Council members, and the school officials, along with the International Pilates Heritage Society, have designed a Pilates program that will be instituted throughout the schools as part of their curriculum. It was supposed to begin this year, but because of COVID, we will be starting the program hopefully in the next school year, in the fall 2021. Proved facts. At no time in history of medicine was it more important than it is right now that organized science undertake an impartial investigation of the facts herein presented and supplement them by an intensive study of this all-important subject. Again, written in 1934 in Your Health. So his vision of rehabilitation and combining Pilates with science, research, is one of the visions that we are also undertaking at this time. The health benefits of Pilates from Time magazine in 2017. Pilates improves balance and core strength, in part by reinforcing the bond between mind and muscles, helping people engage the right muscles in the core. This leads to better posture and control over the body's movement, says Sherry Wells, who is a senior lecturer in physical therapy at Australia's Griffith University. Wells' research found that core strengthening is the perks of Pilates and may also ease pain, improve the quality of daily life for people suffering from low back pain. And we had 23 studies published between 2005 and 2016, and all of them assessed the efficacy of Pilates in rehabilitation for so many different conditions. And in all of these papers, it was found that Pilates improved the outcomes, including pain and disability levels. Pilates for breast cancer recovery. This is also a very important subject, but when compared to conventional modes of exercise and or rehabilitation, Pilates was found to be superior. So the research that's coming out is comparing even conventional exercise and Pilates. It states learning the Pilates principles and repertoire is a huge advantage to the therapy. We're also looking at when we do a controlled study that the Pilates subjects improved flexibility, enhanced control, mobility of the trunk and the pelvis. And so we're looking at controlled studies that are showing how important it is to add Pilates. And where are the roots of this? This is from master teacher Eve Gentry. In 1995, she found a lump in her breast and underwent a radical mastectomy. Her breast and pectoralis major were removed. After her surgery, she went back to the Pilates studio as soon as she was able to begin activity. When she returned to the studio, Joe said to her, "Don't worry, we fix." Mr. Pilates developed a rehabilitation program for radical mastectomy in 1955, long before the notion of general rehabilitation was common, let alone rehabilitation for breast cancer patients. Within 1 year, Eve had regained full range of motion and could complete the entire Pilates repertoire with grace and ease, including advanced exercises and exercises that appear specific to the pectoralis major. We have Pilates for so many things right now, many conditions, injuries, and ailments. And what is so important is that it's being documented and utilized in hospitals and in rehabilitation. We have Pilates for hip and knee syndromes and arthroplasties. We have Pilates for arthritis. We have Pilates for osteoporosis to help increase bone density, increase strength and muscle mass. We have Pilates for scoliosis. And we have Pilates around the world. So his last vision was the whole world should be doing Pilates. As of 2005, there were 11 million people practicing the discipline of Pilates and around 14,000 instructors in the United States. But this is just the beginning. I'm now we have so much more, so many more people, many more practitioners, so many more teachers around the world. And Mr. Pilates, I believe, would be extremely happy to have all of this known, and I think he would be just absolutely thrilled. When I held the conference in Mönchengladbach, in his hometown, which is very small, there were 44 countries that came to his hometown, and that was in 2019. And we look here at the fact that we have so many more countries just here in this conference, and that it is our opportunity to really begin not only to spread Pilates around the world, but to unite Pilates around the world as well. And so we want to end where we began, in Mönchengladbach in Germany. We are now looking at working with the City Council, which is now very, very happy that we are returning to Mönchengladbach and honoring Mr. Pilates in his hometown. And I know all of you can take the time to honor him in your work as well, as we recall the power of his visions and we continue to carry his work into the future, mind, body, and spirit. Thank you for joining me.